to my presentation on sustainability and technology. It's my pleasure to be here in this second annual FinTech conference run by Renmin University. It's my honor. I should say that what I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with some of my collaborators, in particular Alex Sokolov, Jonathan Mostovoy, Flora Geske, and Vanessa Till. I'm very privileged to be able to work with them. And you can see in my opening slide the three organizations that I work for, that I represent. The University of Toronto, as everybody knows, where I am the director of the Risk Lab and the Masters in Mathematical Finance. Sigma Analysis and Management, which is an investment company that I run, and it gives me the ability to see the developments that are taking place in the world of investment and finance as they develop. I consider it to be very privileged that I get that front row view on the developments that are happening today. And a lot of my presentation today is going to be motivated by the interest flows that I see of financial companies worldwide and what they are doing with regards to product development. And last but not least, the GGSJ Center of Digital Management and Technology Innovation. It's an organization that has been created to work with universities worldwide and leverage that university network to achieve education and innovation in the professional space. And I will express my vision, my context of what I want to discuss today with three considerations. The first one is how, in my view, the 20th century was the century of the physical sciences and math. I'm a mathematician, and we all know we have witnessed this tremendous growth both on the mathematics as well as in many aspects of the physical sciences. We sent people to the moon, we explored space, we've developed transportation infrastructures that are unimaginable centuries ago. All of that happened in the 20th century. From a mathematics perspective, math was at the service of the physical sciences, and much of that development was propelled by the growth of math and the ability of mathematics to be at the service of the physical sciences. But now I have a different view. I think that for the 21st century, this is going to be the century of the social sciences, not the physical sciences. However, I continue to believe that mathematics will continue to be the main driving force for our evolution in the social sciences. I think when it comes to sustainability in particular, there are going to be two pillars that are going to be driving sustainability. On the one hand, social science, which will be taking care of its design, but then we're going to see mathematics that will take care of its implementation. The two will work very well together with each other, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is ways in which mathematics is developing a new FinTech triangle, which is going to be the focus for my presentation today. A new FinTech triangle where technology, mathematics, and social science come together to define a new reality, which is taking the financial sector by storm. I want to start with one example that happened in 1990. I have here an article from the New York Times in May 24th, 1990, when something revolutionary happened. Harvard University and the City University of New York decided to eliminate their stocks in tobacco companies. That was a decision that took the financial sector by storm. Back then, this was a very unusual move. Tobacco companies were the most profitable companies from a value creation perspective. In the famous Nabisco deal, that was gave rise to the hedge funds as we know them today, it was said that a tobacco company creates a product for a cent and sells it for $1. That is 100 times profitability. Totally remarkable. It's the best concept of a company worth investing in. Harvard University took the unusual step of stepping away from these very profitable investments, and the rationale for that was driven by the fact that it was considered that tobacco was damaging for the health. So for the first time we saw an event which in a very explicit way told the investment sector that social responsibility considerations were going to be taken into account. Tobacco companies were not particularly hurt by this. It was a very small investment. It was just a few $1 million. $3.5 million of the portfolio was being divested from tobacco companies. But it was the beginning of something very interesting. Perhaps from our perspective today, we can see how a good decision this was. Tobacco companies started to get lawsuits. Lawsuits because they were producing products that were harmful to their clients. Their customers were paying for something that damaged their health. This was considered to be the grounds for social financial responsibility. Tobacco companies started to get sued by the public, and they started to lose those lawsuits. This is interesting because lawsuits tend to diminish the value of a company, and the equation that you produce a product for a cent and you sell it for $1 was no longer relevant. Now you have a situation where you are producing something for a cent, you're selling it for $1, but you're exposed to massive lawsuits. Projecting this forward, a lot of what is driving social responsibility investing is, on the one hand, the responsibility aspect of it, but then there's a financial element that has developed also, which is no one likes to be sued. And the lawsuit in the case of the tobacco companies stopped at the tobacco companies. The shareholders were protected from that. But one can imagine a situation where the shareholders could be held liable for some of those damages. Long-term investors, pension plans, insurance companies, whose time frame is decades, are taking this into consideration, and in addition to the driving forces of social responsibility, there's another driving force, which is the possibility of large losses in the future. The equation doesn't make sense anymore, and many of them, like in 1990, are deciding to be very careful in their choice of their investment portfolio, not from a performance perspective, not from a volatility perspective, but from a social responsibility perspective and the potential losses that could be associated with that in the future, which are unknown and could be large. And this is the beginning of what is called now in the sector ESG, which is going to be one of the topics that I'm going to be discussing in my presentation. From a certain perspective, what we can see, the equation that is at play now, is an equation which is a little bit different. In 1990, we had a situation that the profitability today was questioned because of the possible lawsuits tomorrow. And I'm talking about this in addition to the social responsibility aspects that we all know. I'm talking about this other unknown aspect, which is beginning to be very relevant in finance, considerations of the price of risk. So, to the price of time, which everybody, all of my students know, everybody knows, studies this in finance, we're in another layer, which is the time price of risk, knowing that these are things that could happen 30 years from now. How do you build a 30-year potential liability into an equation? For most investors, it looks like 30 years is a very long period of time, but not for insurance companies, not for pension plans, which are some of the biggest investors that we have in the world today. They are the main drivers for this type of thinking, and now the public is following that. If I look at the evolution of social responsibility, then what we can say is we started from some considerations in impact investing, the impact of our actions, of our investment actions in the world, to a situation where we are about to have well-defined rules and procedures in place that will give us outcomes when it comes to the investment decisions that we make. And this is what, in my definition, leads to sustainability. What have we done over the last, it's actually 90 years, not exactly 100. So I want to go to the first thing that I consider to be the beginning of quantitative investing, and that is the work by John Williams. He was perhaps the first person to come up with the theory of investment value. Back then, the exercise of investing was just finding a good stock and buy it at the best possible price. If you can do that, you're a good investor. And this is what investment was. This then became value investing and Graham and Dodd and all of that, and it created a very, very long and fruitful relationship between quantitative analysis and investing. And we know what that was. The next biggest change happened in 1950 when Harry Markowitz, when he was still a graduate student at Stanford, I think, he realized that in all of the investment theories back then, no one paid attention to the concept of risk. And he came up with the concept of risk that we now know very well is encapsulated in the concept of standard deviation and volatility. I think he created the Markowitz theory. Then he got the Nobel Prize for economics in the 70s, and that was the beginning of a very long relationship between mathematics and investing. Around the year 2000, what we had is the tremendous growth of methods, increasingly sophisticated methods, where we calculate almost anything, and we've come up with investment decisions based on very sophisticated mathematical models. But now I believe that we are at a transition where a lot of that is being replaced by artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of that. And at the heart of that is going to be behavioral issues and social science issues. And for me, the best way to
explain that is by looking at what are the data inputs in all of these models over time. In the 30s, it was basically company accounting information. That's about it. When Markowitz came up with his theories, things changed, and now we started to develop the concept of a time series and how time series were part of the decision-making process. That was changed to the modern models that we now have, where we have very rich Bloomberg type data sets, all structured data, given by time series of increased sophistication, but at the end of the day, it's still time series. Types of data where statistics feels very comfortable, and where the type of analytics that we can do on that are the traditional analytics that we do when dealing with time series, with random variables, and so on and so forth. But that's all changing now. Now, the type of data that the new models are consuming is completely different. We have news articles, we have web pages, we have social media feeds, we have documents, PDFs and others, we have company filings, and so on and so forth. And these things keep growing by the day. I should tell you that there's also now, people are beginning to introduce images and videos in the investment decision process. You may be a little bit surprised by that, but there are people flying drones over parking lots in Walmarts and things like that to get an idea of consumer flow, and you're making now investment decisions based on data of that type. This is tremendous because of several reasons. First, the ability at collecting data and analyzing data is very, very good now. This is vastly improved from what it was only a few years ago, but also because what we can do with it and the type of investment decisions that we can do with it is also being greatly amplified by the theories, in particular in artificial intelligence, that are being created every day. Now, today I'm not going to be focusing on everything that we can do with these new types of data sources. I want to focus on one aspect of it, which I also think is going to be part of the future. And this is the new social context in which investments actually are taking place. And from that perspective, the evolution of social responsibility, which maybe started with Harvard University in the 1990s, it developed into a concept which is ESG, which I want to explain today. But it's actually going beyond that into a term of sustainability that I'm sure you're hearing a lot about. And this is a topic where mathematical finance actually plays a very big role. Okay? And I want to address it with one remark, which is sustainability. I call it the new liability. We are used to thinking of risks and things that could go wrong from a certain perspective. As mathematicians, we like standard deviation, we like value at risk, we like expected shortfall, things like that. But there's a new liability in town, and this is what I would paint under the roof of sustainability. Okay? And sustainability right now is based on three pillars: E, S, and G. E is the environmental impact, which is when you make an investment, you have to ensure that the environment is not harmed by your actions. Example is all the oil companies and what they do in countries, which is very well documented by now. The next is social impact. Ensure that the people around you are not harmed by your actions, that you're not discriminating, you're not putting people in unfair situations. That's the social aspect of that, that's the S. And then G is the governance qualities. Ensure that your guiding principles and processes are sound. These are the three elements which are now attracting the attention of investors, E, S, and G, ESG. And investment methodologies and investment processes, they need to be conforming to this. And the question is, how do you build an investment process which is consistent with these types of considerations? I have maybe just some examples. When it comes to the environment, what we see is that green-powered stocks are favored in these type of investments. Issues about water supply, renewable energy, pollution control, green transportation, waste reduction, all of these are things which are good. People don't look at just risk and return in the old way. They look at the impact of these companies into the environment, and then they are labeled as good or bad. That's as far as we go right now. Okay, and when it comes to social elements, what we have is issues about community impact. For example, if you have a certain development project that hurts people in a certain village, then you're going to be labeled in a negative way from an S perspective when it comes to an ESG score, the way you deal with minorities, or for example, the way you achieve or you treat gender issues. There's this company that I put here on my slide, Equilib, based in the Netherlands, which is looking into, they provide scoring based on gender equality. And investors are taking these things into account and making investment decisions taking these types of information. Okay. This is happening. And when it comes to governance, the principles that govern the organization, the processes that you follow, the ethics, rules, regulation, and compliance are part of that. There are scores which are being done by companies like MSCI and others. And these scores are used by investors to make investment decisions. And the thing is, a few years ago, it was investors that were forward-thinking, like Harvard Investment, Allianz, and others. But now, it's really almost everybody. If you look at most of the investment firms that exist, they are driven by ESG criteria because what? Investors want to invest in things which are ESG consistent. Investors are interested in that. So if you are a portfolio manager, and even if you do not care about any ES or G, turns out that your investors, your clients, that's what they demand. So you have to give it to them. This is what I call the Amazonification of asset management. You have to produce portfolios that sell, not any more portfolios that perform. If you create a very good performing portfolio, but people don't want it, as an asset manager, you're not making any money because you get paid a fee as a function of the assets under management. So you have to respond to the social pressure or the social preferences, because this is your client base. That's what they want. Okay, and some statistics for millennials. These are tremendously important issues, and many people are positioning, thinking that these numbers will grow over time. Okay, so this is as far as my introduction goes. And now what do we do with this? It turns out that today, if we have some papers that they're not part of my presentation today, but we have some papers that seem to indicate that ESG is the biggest momentum trade in town. Meaning that if you invest in companies which are ES or G well rated, then these are the companies which are in demand, and whether from a value perspective don't make sense, or whether they have high volatility, or these things don't seem to matter because the market are driving these valuations higher as part of a very big momentum trade. And that means you have to be aware of what is driving this, because if this is being driven by social pressure, then momentum trends do have reversals, and then you can get hurt in the momentum reversals. So it's important to understand companies, not just from the ES and G perspective, but also because of what may be the drivers that are driving these ES or G characterizations. And the traditional approach to doing this is through human implementation, which is rules-based systems done by humans. Humans analyze documents, humans look at filings, humans draw their conclusions, and at the end of the day, they produce scores. Sometimes they are very difficult to obtain, they're slow, subjective, they are questionables, and sometimes they provide no evidence of sustainability, they just follow rules. What we're trying to do is we're trying to do a different approach. First of all, we're trying to follow an approach which is very rich on the data sources, and we have used Twitter data, we have used New York Times data, and some of these we're working on now. Okay. This is where the data sources come from. As you can see, this is not Bloomberg anymore. This is not company valuations. This is very rich data sets that come from a variety of sources. Then we analyze it using natural language processing methods. We determine materiality, and then we draw consequences as a function of that. This is what we do. I have an example here. You take a certain company, and then we analyze Twitter data. We look at the number of tweets, and then we see all those tweets, how many of them follow under certain categories. And when you do, then you determine how many of them are negative, how many of them are positive, and then the score is calculated as a function of this. You can get these things done mostly by computers. We'll still have to do some manual work, but eventually this all is going to be done by a computer. This is the new type of analysis which is done. We do it using BERT methods, which you may or may not know. This BERT stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. This is one of the areas in artificial intelligence that neural network based, and it's the one, if you don't know what this is what your spam filters use. This is what Google uses for their search engines to determine the context of how you use words. Words could have different meanings in different contexts. This is what BERT methods do. These techniques have been developed. We didn't have to develop them themselves. We just need to adapt them to this situation. I am going to skip over the description of what transformers are, and I'm going to end with one example, which is a business case we did for two companies, Facebook and Starbucks. Okay, and to show that you see how that works. For the case of Facebook, what I have here is an example. We took I think this was with the Twitter feeds. We look at Twitter data, and then we saw the taped number of tweets that we could find on the company Facebook over time. How many were positive, how many were negative. We saw that most of them were negative. We could determine that using NLP. Some were positive here and there. And this is when it comes to one category, which is social capital. Okay, when it comes to governance, we could do the same thing, and then what we see is that over time, again, we have a certain trend, mostly negative. We can do this according different categories, and then we can come up with our own score, which is here. This is our ESG score, which has the advantage that it's not done by human, it's done by a machine. We can see how it evolves over time. It gives us a very replicable score over time, and we can create we can even go back years and redo the scores very fast. And here is another way of doing something similar. This is done with a program developed by Alex Sokolov, my collaborator through his company SRAI, and the database that is used here is a combination. You have data from the New York Times, we have data from Reddit, we have data from Twitter and others, and what we have is the ability to come up or define different types of criteria, different types of scoring words, objectives, and have the computer go through history, go through time, and see the impact of each of these perspectives on the particular company or object that we're interested in. Very interesting. It gives us a very granular approach to doing scoring very granular approach to understand what people are thinking, what people are saying, and analyzing databases in a very productive manner. And in an attempt to understand how this is done from a technology perspective, I want to focus here on the technology triangle that I've been talking about for a very long time. We have a technology triangle tells us how things work. And traditionally there is three vertices to that triangle. On the one hand, there is algorithms. This has been the objective of all the work done in the 20th century. This is what engineering was about. This is what mathematicians have been doing for a long time. And recently, algorithms have become what are called free. There has been a process of democratization of algorithms. Artificial intelligence produces ways of doing things, algorithms, which are now, I would say, free, publicly available, or even if they're not, the value is greatly diminished. Nothing can work without them, but that is not where the focus is. The competitive advantages offered by algorithms are diminishing over time. Instead, what we see is that data is the new gold. Data is what marks a difference in our ability to do things. What will mark a difference between one company or another is their ability or their ownership of data. Not so much what they can do with it, because these techniques exist and are available to people. It is the ownership of the data. And then we have on the other vertex, we have the hardware, which has become a commodity. The fantastic hardware we have now, the speed that computers have when they do computations, is what has made artificial intelligence possible. But this is also not an area where there is a lot of competitive advantages when it comes to our ability to do things. Data is the new gold. And if we look at this from a cloud perspective, cloud computing is actually merging the traditional hardware and software elements are now being merged into a single entity, all cloud-based. And again, this is something that you have access to. It has been commoditized to a large extent, and it's making data something much more interesting and clearly distinctive when it comes to processes and the way they affect what we can do. One footnote though, the footnote is cybersecurity. If you have a risk management perspective, we talked about risk from an ESG perspective, risk of course from volatility perspectives, but the risk from a cybersecurity perspective is considerable, and this affects mostly cloud-based systems, and these have yet to be quantified. Okay, good. So if everything is about data, if we have now a data-based approach to doing things, some considerations that I have is that the big data banks like Facebook, for example, in the Western world, or for example the move by Goldman Sachs to create their own version of Bloomberg, not so much for the data but for the communications between people, to replace the Bloomberg chat with a new chat, or of course the predominance of Amazon Web Services and what they can do for us. This is where we're going to see a lot of the new elements that are coming up in the future for us. Databases contain now not only numbers, but also words, videos, images, very rich data sets, as we have seen. And algorithms will have to adapt. For an algorithm to use video is something which is normal these days. And I will end my data discussion with one consideration, which is the impact of regulation on data. Right now, data is largely unregulated in the sense of our access to it and how data can be used for certain purposes. What we see here in this diagram that I have is how every market event, every crisis, every crash has created its reaction from a regulatory side of things. The 1929 crash created the Securities Act of 1933. The Enron scandal created the SOX regulation in 2002. The 2008 financial crisis created the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010. I'm curious what COVID will do when it comes to regulation. It may actually do something, but what event will give rise to data regulation? That we don't know. Okay, but I suspect it's coming. It's coming to us very soon. Another aspect of this is the role of robo advisors. Robo advisors, not so much as machines that allow us to make better decisions, but robo advisors as a strategy that changes the way we do things. In a traditional approach, what we have is the typical engineering processes. You define the strategy, from where you get infrastructure, from where you get started, then you deliver the product and you scale. That's it. It's a linear system. Okay. What we have now is a different way of doing things, where the same strategy goes to infrastructure, goes to get started, delivery, and scale becomes a constant feedback loop where you keep on improving what you're doing in a non-linear way. So this is also going to have a change in the way we do these processes going forward. And another consideration is the issue of currencies. How many currencies will we have in the future? Well, right now we have 180 country currencies, fiat currencies, backed by governments. Some are digital already, some are not. Okay, we have cryptocurrencies, which have been around for a long time. They are used as payment vehicles. They have a lot of issues, especially on AML, and the way that many of them are used for illegal activity. The fact is that they are there, but what I wanted to also highlight is the creation of new coins, new types of currency, which are linked to new financial objects. And I want to explain this with one example, and it's the example of a sports fund, something that exists. And what the sports fund does is it selects a professional sports player, for example, and early in their career, someone that observers have a high expectation that they'll become very successful and very wealthy. And what they do is they have a way of financing their professional career early through a loan, through some sort of a mechanism to give them money early in their career with a security, with some sort of a collateral, which is their future cash flows from their contracts, their future cash flows from their merchandising activity, or any other thing. This is something which has been done and can be done, but now the interesting part is that we can do all of this from a very interesting securitization perspective, where each person each professional player creates a stock by securitizing this loan activity, and this can be created as a token, as a coin, as a cryptocurrency, which is linked to a person, to a professional player. You can trade this on the blockchain just like any other cryptocurrency. And the interesting thing is that the value of these things will increase over time, not only because, in the case that these players become successful, but also because fans may drive the value of this currency up beyond the value that backs them. Okay, so that's another impact of how social science can drive the value of assets. In this case, a coin linked to a person that may become famous. And I want to end with an application of how everything we have discussed can be used to create a sustainable society. I want to talk about the concept of a risk exchange. To understand how risk is exchanged, let's look at a very simple decision-making game. I have game one, where people are given two choices. Choice A, you will be given $900 with a 100% chance. Choice B, you will be given $1,000 with a 90% probability and $0 with a 10% probability. If offered this choice, most people, they choose A. They both have the same payoff. The payoff is the same, $900. That's the expectation. However, most people go for choice A. If instead we change the game, we go to game two, and we give people a choice. Choice A is that you're going to lose $900 for sure. Choice B is that you will lose $1,000 with a 90% probability, but it's a 10% chance that you don't lose anything. In this case, people usually take B, option B. Again, the payoff is the same. Why this asymmetry? Why do people prefer choice A in the first example and choice B in the second one? Risk aversion. This is a type of risk aversion which is purely behavioral. It's hard to express this in a quantitative manner. So if that is the case, we can understand how trades will happen between players, how players will trade risk. If someone prefers one type of game to another, and a different person has a different preference for whatever the reason, then they can actually exchange risk between the two of them, and they both earn something in that risk exchange. Okay, that's the theoretical way of looking at things. If I see how these things have actually happened over time, we see that the first example of such a risk exchange came from, it was expressed already in the Code of Hammurabi from the year 1750 BC. So this is approximately almost 4,000 years ago. Almost 4,000 years ago. Okay? Almost. And this was the first documented example of the creation of an insurance company. What they did is they offered some sort of a payment if a shipment had any trouble, any difficulties. So the first example of an insurance trade, or the first example of a risk trade. Another one came about 1,000 years after that, in the year 500 BC, documented by Aristotle in his book, The Politics, where he describes the story of Thales. Thales, the famous mathematician who did the theorem with the two parallel lines that are crossed by another one, the angles are the same. This mathematician Thales, what he did is did something very interesting. He observed that there was a very large olive harvest coming up, so he bought an option to use the olives mills at the right time, whenever he wanted, for a fee. So he paid some money. He wasn't rich, he was poor, but he had some money. He used the money to buy the right to use those mills. And when the big harvest came up, he exercised his right, and then he owned the mills for a day. So that paid off tremendous multiples of his original investments. It is the first recorded example of an options trade. Further on, closer to our times, the first rice exchange was created in Osaka in the year 1697, and this allowed consumers and producers of rice to exchange risks with each other. So producers could lock in the price of rice so it wouldn't drop below a certain price in the case of a lot of production, and consumers would lock in the price so it would not go up for them in the case of scarcity. And what makes this example interesting and different is that this was not just an actual transaction. This was an organized system that people used to trade rice futures with each other. There was the concept of a clearinghouse, an actual exchange that facilitated the exchange of risk between bidders, typically the rice consumers, and producers who would then ask for a price for their goods to be delivered. Everything done through the risk exchange that ensures that these transactions happen and they eliminate a credit risk. After that, we have Chicago in the 19th century became the city it is now because they became the central clearinghouse for a lot of other similar types of activity, creating the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, later the Options Exchange, and so on and so forth. So these are all examples of risk exchanges. And what we can now hypothesize is that in the near future, there's going to be a very large risk exchange where buyers and sellers can go and exchange risk with each other. And this could be agricultural products, they would be coins, cryptocurrencies, like the ones that we saw earlier, for example, linked to people, weather derivatives, which are beginning to be very active now, or who knows, maybe there is the possibility of trading pandemic risk with each other for people that have different, that get impacted differently by certain natural phenomena. These are now possible to be scaled very, very intensely through the use of blockchain technologies. So this is something which is it could happen any time now. From this perspective, one could hypothesize that soon we're going to see more currencies than people. Why not? People have assets. You have a house. That house could become your own currency. You have a car. That car may be your currency. You can borrow money to buy a car by issuing coins, for example. This could happen. And this leads to a very interesting concept of a currency exchange, where you have billions of currencies being exchanged with each other, and a market that gives you liquidity and a price between those currencies being exchanged. All of this can be done with technology today. We're looking at a very large, perhaps even exaggerated perspective on this, but we do have the technology infrastructure today that allows us to settle these trades in real time, become transparent, cheap, and do not distinguish between a buyer and a seller. People are just exchanging risk with each other. So this is a very interesting way in which sustainability could be achieved, because when risk can be traded, risk can be mitigated. And with this, I end my presentation. I want to thank the organizers of this event, and I wish for this event to be very successful to all of us. Thank you.